Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning into our event on South Korea's quest to deepen partnerships with ASEAN and India. I'm Katie Botto. I'm a senior research analyst in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. It's good morning from DC, but good evening to all of our panelists who are joining us from across Asia, some of them very late in the evening. So thank you very much for participating despite the late timing. And what we'll be discussing today is South Korea's growing relationships with India and ASEAN member states, especially in the context of the New Southern Policy, which is the Moon administration's flagship foreign policy initiative to elevate South Korea's relations with Southeast Asia and India. I've also released a paper today on the same topic entitled South Korea Beyond Northeast Asia, How Seoul is Deepening Ties with India and ASEAN. So if you're interested in learning more about this topic and reading the report, you can access that on Carnegie's website. And I think that someone will also be dropping a link in the YouTube chat. So this topic and South Korea's relationships with this particular group of nations, I think, is really important to discuss because it provides a window into how South Korea is approaching some of its most pressing foreign policy challenges. In the DC policy community, we're often very focused on South Korea's relations with North Korea, China, the United States, Japan. But if you look at South Korea's ties to countries like India and Southeast Asian nations, you can see how South Korea is increasingly looking to other relationships and partnerships in Asia to deal with the uncertainties posed by great power competition and to strengthen its ability to lead as a middle power and to drive its economic growth. So these are just a few of the motivations behind the Moon administration's New Southern Policy, which aims to elevate ties with India and ASEAN to the same level of South Korea's relations with China, Japan, the United States, and Russia. And this policy was launched in 2017, so about 4 years ago. And with the Moon administration's tenure ending in just under a year, I think now is a great time to be reviewing the policy's effectiveness, and that is part of what we plan to do today. So I'm very excited to be joined today by 4 of the foremost experts on this topic. And I'll introduce them and then we'll get started straight into questions. So first, I'm joined by Dr. Wongi Choe, coming to us from Seoul. Dr. Choe is the head of the Center for ASEAN and India Studies at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, where he leads research on the New Southern Policy. He's also a professor in the Department of International Economy and Trade Studies at KMDA. So I'm sure you can tell from his bio and title that this topic is really his bread and butter. So we're very lucky to have him joining us today. We also have Dr. Chiew-Ping joining us from Malaysia. She is a senior lecturer in the Strategic Studies and International Relations program at the National University of Malaysia. She's an expert on all things Korea and Southeast Asia, including the New Southern Policy, and her ability to cover such a breadth of issues in these relationships in her research and writing is really impressive, so I'm sure we'll be learning a lot from Chiew-Ping this morning. And we also have Dr. Jagannath Panda joining us from New Delhi. Jagannath is a research fellow and coordinator of the East Asia Center at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, where he is a prolific writer and analyst on a broad range of issues, including India-Korea relations, the New Southern Policy, North Korea, India-China relations, and much more. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his perspective, especially on the India angle. Next, last but not least, we have Dr. Andrew Yeo. Andrew is a professor of politics and director of Asian studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., though he's joining us from Manila today. And he was also recently named the SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies at the Brookings Institute. Andrew is the author of an impressive 5 books on Asian politics and foreign policy, including his most recent, which was published, I think, less than a month ago, entitled State, Society, and Markets in North Korea. So congratulations to Andrew on both of those new professional developments. I relied a great deal on these panelists' publications and expertise during my research for this report, as well as their support and feedback. So I'm very grateful they could join us today. And I also want to thank the Korea Foundation for their support of this project, as well as Jonathan Formella for his research assistance. And a big shout out to Carnegie's communication staff, who really went above and beyond in editing the report, creating graphics, supporting this event, and so much more. And now we can get into the questions. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists a question, and then we'll save the last 20 to 30 minutes of this event for audience questions. So please be thinking of anything you might want to ask the panelists, and we'll prompt you for those questions in the chat when the time comes. So my first question is for Dr. Choe, and I want to talk about the motivations behind the new Southern policy. So as I mentioned briefly, the policy is motivated in part by a desire for South Korea to grow its middle power leadership. It also represents an attempt to recalibrate South Korea's diplomatic priorities commensurate to Southeast Asia and India's economic and strategic importance in the region, as these countries have remained secondary in South Korea's foreign policy for the most part. But perhaps the most important motivation is the need to diversify South Korea's economic and strategic partnerships to mitigate the uncertainties posed by great power dynamics in the region. So can you please explain for us why this is so imperative and how it has shaped the new Southern policy, and why Southeast Asian countries and India are good partners in this endeavor?
Okay, Katie. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for inviting me to this webinar. And I'm very glad to be able to see my good friends from India, Malaysia, and Manila. First of all, I think, Katie, your paper is really good at covering New Southern Policy, NSP for short, in a very balanced and comprehensive manner. So I think I actually enjoyed reading advanced copy of your paper. You said that your paper will be up on the Carnegie website tomorrow. I think your paper is going to be a very useful resource for international audiences who'd like to know more about the New Southern policy. And I think your paper would be a good guide to understand what South Korean government has been doing for the last 4 years with counterparts in Southeast Asia and India. Yeah, I would like to make a very short comment regarding the motivations behind the Southern policy. Katie, I very much agree with your argument in your paper that the key motivation behind the New Southern policy is diversification, economic as well as diplomatic. I also agree with you that South Korea's concern about Chinese influence both motivates and constrains New Southern policy. The heavy economic reliance on China is increasingly becoming a strategic burden to Korea. China tends to weaponize asymmetrical trade interdependence as a political tool impose its political will over smaller countries, including South Korea. You give a very vivid example of this Chinese economic coercion in your paper, the THAAD debacle in 2017, right? So Korean government decided to deploy the THAAD missile defense system in 2016, and China very strongly kind of protested against this, and China employed a informal economic coercive measures, and a lot of Korean firms suffered from this measure. So this provided a kind of wake-up call for Korean firms and government, and provided the basis for economic diversification, which is one important part of the New Southern policy. So I think the economic diversification through New Southern policy is a kind of strategic imperative for South Korea. The economic diversification is getting all the more important as South Korea is getting exposed to the fallouts of trade disputes between U.S. and China. So to the extent U.S.-China great power rivalry gets intensified, then we have a greater strategic need to diversify and try to create some sort of rooms to maneuver. And also in strategic dimension, South Korea has very dire need to diversify and expand its diplomatic horizon and network. Especially, we have increasing pressure from US-China rivalry, which is constraining our strategic autonomy and diplomatic choices. So we want to expand our strategic space and rooms to maneuver by expanding diplomatic ties with like-minded partners in Southeast Asia and India in particular. Also, I think NSP, New policy represents South Korea's middle power ambition. As a robust middle power in the Indo-Pacific, we want to take on greater regional roles and expand our network of influence in the region. But however, as Katie, you very well explains in your paper, Korea's engagement in regional peace and stability is the weakest element in the new Southern policy. South Korea mainly focuses on economic and functional cooperation areas and does not give priority to regional strategic and security issues, such as South China Sea. So I think this is the result of deliberate strategic consideration by the Moon administration in Seoul in order not to get entangled in the ongoing US-China rivalry. In particular, the current Moon administration is very cautious vis-a-vis China and is making every effort uh, to get along well with China and not to antagonize China. So this sort of approach by Moon administration, that is South Korea's China policy, is what really constrains the new Southern policy. So this is why South Korea is deliberately avoiding, for example, taking a clearer position about issues like South China Sea. South Korea usually emphasizes the importance of freedom of navigation, like other countries, like United States, Japan, and Australia. But you stop there. You don't go over beyond the red line about China. That is, South Korea never openly criticizes what China is doing in South China Sea. So this is what they call the strategic ambiguity, right? So I think this kind of approach is not optimal strategy for South Korea. So I think Seoul needs to be more proactive in issues of regional peace and stability down the road. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind words about my paper. That means a lot coming from you. I think that sums up really well the motivations and constraints behind this policy. And now I want to turn to Chiew-Ping and talk more in depth, specifically about South Korea's relationships with individual ASEAN member states. So South Korea, obviously, this is not the first, foray into Southeast Asia. South Korea has deep relationships with many countries there. Especially Vietnam, which I cover a lot in the paper, Singapore and others. But some relationships have lagged and some ties are more nascent. So where do you think South Korea has succeeded in addressing gaps in its approach to the region under the new Southern policy, and where is attention still uneven?
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for inviting me here to have this dialogue. I would like to pick up where Professor Choe has left off, which is about in the areas where not only South Korea's external partners and allies expect the country to be more proactive, it is the same sentiment can be felt in Southeast Asia. So especially in the maritime area, so whether it is non-traditional security like maritime governments or the shipping industry, port management. So there is a lot of expectation for South Korea to fill in the gap, especially the capacity gaps among the ASEAN countries. However, just like what Professor Choe has said, that South Korea has a lot of reservations when it comes to South China Sea area, so maritime, and there are several great power actors. So the hesitation actually is one of the major challenges in implementing new Southern policy. And this is where also South Korea try to complement each of the individual countries in ASEAN in which technological base, cyber, business, and different economic strength has been cultivated. So that also include defense industry cooperation with Indonesia and the Philippines, and now also extending to Thailand. So the niche-based cooperation is the right direction for South Korea's new Southern policy. And given the recent developments since the global pandemic last year, so health diplomacy has been embedded in the new Southern policy plus. So we can see that this policy is flexible and with high adaptability. So if the South Korean government, no matter who will win the next presidential election next year, there is no doubt that new Southern policy would be continued to be pursued by the working officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because it only makes sense to focus on ASEAN region, Southeast Asia, which is a pivotal region in the Indo-Pacific strategy or the Indo-Pacific framework that so many countries are now introducing. So I would say that South Korea has succeeded in terms of gaining trust and commitment. The remaining challenges is pretty much domestic based, where the Thai domestic instability last year and this year we also witnessed political instability in Malaysia, and also Myanmar. The Myanmar crisis has also posed a challenge in how to coordinate with ASEAN Secretariat, for instance, and also how does the investment direction should be redirected or rethink. So that's all from me, and I will look forward to hear more from the others.
Great, thank you. And now I want to turn to Jagannath to hear more about how India fits into this policy and South Korea's approach to the region. So I think you could say that South Korea and India's relationship has sort of moved in fits and starts. They've often faced some difficulties sustaining momentum and economic and strategic cooperation. So where do you think the new Southern policy and recent developments have been successful in strengthening this relationship, and where do obstacles remain, and what can the two countries do to address those obstacles going forward?
Thank you, Kathy. Let me compliment you for your excellent paper, working paper, and I think your paper will be a reference point for many scholars in times to come, those who are interested to study in details the new Southern policy and factoring South Korea's engagement with the region. It's also a great privilege for me to share this platform with some of the good friends and excellent scholars on the subject. I think I'll echo and complement most of the line of thoughts that Professor Choe and Chiew-Ping has actually said. I think I'll begin by saying that when we're talking about new Southern policy with regard to India, here we are talking about India and South Korea's relationship in a regional context. And there we are talking about two critical economies, those two critical economies which are ranked as the top 15 GDP ranked economy. So to that effect, I think the new Southern policy has definitely helped India-South Korea relations to stay on guard, to move forward, to build confidence, and to stay engaged with a more concentrated official mechanisms of dialogues and debates, and try to push forward the trade and economic contacts. But again, I think we need to see critically, as you rightly asked, that where has it not really succeeded? And I think that is the key question here. And I think here we are talking about a special strategic partnership between India and South Korea when we are talking about South Korea's new Southern policy. And I think what needs to be mentioned here is that I think there are a lot of promises, but little has been achieved. And this is primarily because there has been a lack of confidence on each other. Even though India and South Korea are special strategic partnership, but I think three specific factors has been constantly bothering them not to have confidence on each other. One is India's ties with North Korea. And I think Seoul has been concerned and worried about India's ties with North Korea for a long time. And therefore, Seoul has been hesitant to completely open up a kind of a robust partnership with India. From India's point of view, I think the second factor is, I think, India's relationship with Japan. That has actually moved forward a lot. India-Japan relationship has actually been a statement for many parts in the world today, and it is one of those reference points in the Indo-Pacific politics. That has actually subdued the India-South Korea ties, particularly casted as a kind of a subtle shadow over the New Southern policy. The third factor, I think Professor Choe rightly mentioned, that South Korea's strong economic ties with China and Moon Jae-in's careful approach towards China. And I think there, both India and South Korea probably have a different approach. South Korea has been much more careful in terms of its relationship with China, but India has been quite aggressive and assertive in its relationship with China, given the Chinese aggression and assertiveness towards India. And I think this has not really helped. These three issues has not really helped to gain confidence. But quickly, I think what we need to understand is that New Southern policy was primarily aimed to diversify and expand South Korea's economic and diplomatic contacts in order to reduce South Korea's strategic dependence on China and US in the longer run. And I think to that effect, I think to some extent in some specific areas, the New Southern policy has succeeded and India-South Korea relationship has moved forward. For example, in some specific areas of infrastructure cooperation, smart transportation issues, waterways, road infrastructure, building ports, I think there are some progress has happened between India and South Korea. Similarly, on the defense collaboration, and I think South Korea is emerging as a reliable and key defense partner for India. Shipbuilding is one of those areas where India-South Korea relationship is moving forward. We are talking about cyber cooperation between India and South Korea in a big way. Renewable energy, solar energy is emerging as a critical area. And I think to that effect, if you see Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Moon Jae-in met in 2018 to talk about early harvest package to improve the trade ties between India and South Korea. So I think there are new areas of cooperation is happening. Much credit to the New Southern policy. In fact, my last point here would be that the South Korean government has introduced a K New Deal, and the K New Deal is talking about digital New Deal and green New Deal, and in both these areas, India is gradually emerging as a confidence partner for South Korea, and in fact, Moon Jae-in's New Deal and India's Atmanirbhar Bharat, that is self-reliant India, that Prime Minister Modi is talking about. There are new types of cooperation is happening, and both the countries have actually started talking about how to cooperate on the new supply chain initiatives. So these are the areas where the New Southern policy has actually contributed. But again, I think there is a lack of confidence still visible between India and South Korea, and that has not really been helpful in terms of really actualizing the special strategic partnership into a full confident-oriented partnership. I'll wait for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And especially interesting point about the connections between the Korean New Deal and India's domestic policies, and hopefully there's a lot of effort to make connections between those two in the future. So lastly, I want to turn to Andrew, and after Andrew answers this, we'll turn to audience questions. So you can start putting those in the YouTube chat now if you like. I think someone will be prompting you there. So I think the other panelists have set this question up pretty well. As we've heard from them, a lot of criticism of New Southern policy centers on Seoul's reluctance to address sensitive regional security issues in order to avoid antagonizing China. It's much more focused on the economic pillar. Security issues are mostly relegated to non-traditional security cooperation. But do South Korea's relationships with ASEAN and India need to be securitized? Is this a necessity, and what costs or benefits would come from securitizing South Korea's approach to these countries?
Hey, thanks, Katie, for that question. And before I answer that, I also wanted to just say something really quickly about your new report. And this report is just really fantastic. As Dr. Choe mentioned, it's one of the most comprehensive reports I think we've seen in English. that covers the new Southern policy. And it may also be one of the last reports we see before a change in administration. So I highly recommend everyone to read it. Now, to your question about whether relations with ASEAN and India need to be securitized, the short answer of this is no. And Seoul can continue to focus on the prosperity and people pillars of the new Southern policy. And I would agree that the greatest gains in deepening ties with India and ASEAN are in the economic realm. But as you've already alluded to in your question and also in your report, South Korea will likely face increasing costs by not building out the peace pillar and divorcing its economic relationship with ASEAN and India from a broader strategic context. The line between economics and security has become increasingly blurred, especially in the wake of US-Sino competition. Regional trade, supply chain resilience, infrastructure investment, and the setting of technology standards, all of these things carry strategic implications. It would be prudent to think about the downstream security effects of expanding economic ties in Southeast and South Asia, and to not overly compartmentalize the prosperity and peace dimensions of the NSP. For instance, the very rationale of moving production networks out of China into Vietnam is as much strategic as it is an economic issue. China has also probably taken note that Korean companies have been exiting its market. So I would also note that the adoption of a neutral position in the Indo-Pacific does not necessarily prevent China from bullying Korea. For instance, although the Moon government has been careful not to upset Beijing, this hasn't prevented Chinese fishermen from violating South Korea's exclusive economic zone in the Yellow Sea or off the coast of the North-South Korea border, or Chinese planes from breaching Korea's air defense identification zone. And we've seen similar things happening in Southeast Asia. The Philippines also had around 100 Chinese vessels in the South China Sea, or in the West Philippine Sea, as they call it here. So these are issues that are not just for ASEAN to deal with, but South Korea also has similar problems as well, on these security and defense issues. So defense and security issues need not be at the center of relations with ASEAN or India, but it would be beneficial to think about the new Southern policy more comprehensively. The cost of not doing so puts South Korea at a disadvantage as it loses its agency and autonomy in shaping the regional security environment. And after all, this is what the new Southern policy is about, is to give South Korea some of its own autonomy. At best, I'd say more conversations with ASEAN and India are needed to address common security problems and to ensure that international norms are upheld to protect the exclusive economic zones and maritime rights of regional actors. So I do think there is much more avenue for cooperation on these security issues, and hopefully, whoever picks up on the policy on Southeast Asia and India policy in the next government can build off some of the existing work and tie together some of these loose ends. Thanks.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the comments on the report. I'm very flattered. Everyone being very kind about it, and it is great to be hosting everyone here and to have had the opportunity to write on this issue. I think we don't necessarily pay enough attention to it in DC, but it is important, and like you said, I think it will continue to be important in the future. So. Now we do want to turn to audience questions, but I think we're still waiting for some to come in. So while we do that, I want to turn to North Korea for a little bit more. I think Jagannath talked about this briefly, and North Korea gaining support for inter-Korean peace building is one of the goals of the New Southern Policy. That's probably the closest to a traditional security issue that's included in it. But do India and Southeast Asian countries have a substantial role to play in inter-Korean relations and North Korean denuclearization? Whoever wants to take that can go ahead. maybe Dr. Choe, I
Yeah.
think you might have thoughts.
Well, actually, I think I remember it was 2018. When President Moon visited Singapore, he gave a lecture, Singapore lecture at the ISIS institution, research institution, and the main topic of his Singapore lecture speech was how ASEAN can help South Korea to deal with the issues related to North Korea. All of the 10 ASEAN member countries have diplomatic relationship with North Korea. And for example, countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, Cambodia, these countries have a very solid relationship with North Korea in Cold War years and even nowadays, right? So whenever North Koreans do bad things, and whenever they do good things, they do in Southeast Asia, right? So several years ago, North Korean agent kind of assassinated Kim Jong-un's half-brother, Kim Jong-nam. It was in Malaysia, right? So some of the expectations that the Moon administration had on Southeast Asian countries is that they may be provided some sort of intermediating role in pulling North Koreans out of the kind of shelter on the Korean Peninsula and open to international society. So the Singapore North Korea United States summit, US DPRK summit in Singapore and Vietnam was the prime example that the members of ASEAN provided the venue for this important kind of summit. So in that way, we expected some sort of a more proactive role of Southeast Asian partners in doing business with North Korea. But I guess we have a little bit of over expectation about the possible role that ASEAN can have. Katie, as you pointed out in your paper, I think there is some difference in the priority of security policies of South Korea and ASEAN countries, right? I mean, we expect South Koreans, Southeast Asians do something more about Korean Peninsula issue, but Southeast Asian partners do have some expectation on Korea that Korea plays something bigger role regarding the South China Sea issues, things like that. But as I pointed out, briefly pointed out, South Korean government has been very not so proactive regarding South China Sea issue because we primarily regard this issue as an issue between the China and United States, and we don't want to get entangled with the great power rivalry. So I think this is a little bit of more kind of inactive, kind of a passive approach. We need to be more proactive and confident about this. So I think overall, I mean, whatever policies we have regarding North Korea, we need to have some broad and supportive international kind of support, right? So in that regard, I think with this New Southern Policy Initiative, we would like to have expand the support basis of our North Korean policy in international community. So this applies to Southeast Asia as well as India as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew, I saw you unmuted. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, it's just to add, I don't have anything more to add really to what Dr. Chan mentioned, but I do just want to say that the expectations for North Korea is in part contingent on how relations between North Korea and the U.S. and inter-Korea relations are going, especially inter-Korea relations, how they're going. And had the wheels kept turning after the Hanoi summit in 2019, and then the promises of investment, economic engagement had materialized. I think there could have been expectations for ASEAN countries or even India to play more of a role because they have diplomatic relations with North Korea. It's unfortunate because things froze or basically came to a complete halt after Hanoi that hasn't materialized. So I think part of it is also contingent on the international, the environmental context for which, where we see North Korea. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Great, and we do have some audience questions coming in, so I want to go to those. Kyle Ferrier from the Korea Economic Institute asks, what are the prospects for South Korea deepening its ties with ASEAN beyond Vietnam? So in my report, I focus on Vietnam a lot because that is South Korea's most robust and fastest growing relationship in the region. But what are prospects in other countries?
Yeah, so if I may take this question, thank you, Carl. I think due to their approaches through New Southern policy, South Korea tends to identify niche-based cooperation with different sets of countries. So under NSP, there was a Korea-Mekong strategic cooperation framework. So basically, countries in the mainland Southeast Asia were covered under these sets of initiative. Whereas for those who are the maritime nations, so they would tend to specify in the specific maritime cooperation that they go for. For instance, there were shipping industries, and that there is also maritime security governance. There was also some form of law of the sea discussion, think tank exchange that occurred for the past few years. So beyond Vietnam, Singapore has become the core country to coordinate on ASEAN Smart Cities Network, and also to apply cybersecurity cooperation ASEAN-wide. And as for Indonesia, because it houses ASEAN Secretariat, so that is the place where most of the New Southern policy would be announced and also be applied to the rest of the Southeast Asian countries. So given the economic, politic, and social cultural that has been implemented simultaneously, so we see multi-layers of cooperation with different sets of countries. You can say there is a little mini-lateralism going on as well, and some of those initiatives are competitive or complementary to the other existing strategy, like Japan's quality partnership for infrastructure, and also China's Belt and Road Initiative, in the way South Korea's New Southern policy has provided ASEAN countries with alternatives to benefit from.
Yes, I think that sums things up very well. And then I think you just mentioned Japan briefly. Our next question touches on that Japan factor as well. So they ask, can South Korea form partnerships with India, Australia, and Southeast Asia while feuding with Japan? Anybody? I'm not sure who would like to take that question. I feel like you would all have something to say about it, Andrew.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in terms of forming partnerships, it's really looking at, the question is, hidden in that question is a question about the Quad. But it's challenging because Korea is still reluctant to, we have to look at this from the perspective of Indo-Pacific strategy. That's where India, Australia, and of course the United States is there. Southeast Asia has their own ASEAN outlook, but South Korea, since Biden has come into office, has talked more about Indo-Pacific strategy, but it hasn't. I still don't think they fully embrace that language or narrative, and I've written a report on this as well too. And part of it does stem, I think, from seeing this as initiated from Japan or coming out of Japan. So it does make it harder. And I've always asked this reverse question of, if you look at the Quad, whether other Quad members would want South Korea to join, would they be welcome? Australia, I think yes. I'm not so sure about Japan. Japan would probably say, well, what if we need to improve our bilateral relationship first? So it'd be a little bit awkward. What happened to South Korea suddenly demands that it join the Quad. So the feelings may also be somewhat mutual as well too. So partnerships with certain countries may be a little bit trickier, with at least when you think about it in terms of trilaterals or minilaterals, if you put Japan into the equation.
Absolutely.
Well, can I add a little bit? Well, as Andrew and Jagannath pointed out, I think the really worsen the relationship, bilateral relationship with Japan is really an important pulling factor for South Korea to not be able to go more proactive regarding the collaboration with the United States, Australia, and other countries. I mean, if you look at how South Korean government have implemented New Southern policy for the past 4 years, that it's mostly bilateral way. We could align our NSP with U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy or other countries' regional initiative, right? We have many similar regional initiatives, Australia, Japan, and even these days, European countries, right? But mostly we do not have any substantive kind of alignment with other countries. So I think we need to kind of make greater efforts to engage in multilateral cooperation with other like-minded countries. So the bad relationship, bilateral relationship with Japan is really kind of what pulls down the potential of New Southern policy. And also, it is my observation that Korean government have tried to distance away a little bit, try to keep some sort of a distance from U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So try to stay kind of in between U.S. and China, right? So to my knowledge, Korean government try to make efforts that the Korea's New Southern policy NSP is totally different approach from U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So in that regard, NSP is not a kind of Indo-Pacific strategy that other countries pursue. India has its own version of Indo-Pacific strategy. Japan has its own version, and other countries its own Indo-Pacific strategy. But South Korean government's officials do emphasize that NSP is not a version of Indo-Pacific strategy. It is something different. So to the extent we have some similarity and convergences, we are open to collaborate with any other initiatives, whether it is Belt and Road Initiative or things like that. So in that way, you try to distance a little bit away from the U.S. approach and also Japan's Indo-Pacific approach. So in that regard, I think that is also a factor that constrains the potential of New Southern policy.
Yeah, Dr. Panda, I wonder if you could put this in the context of India a little bit, since India and Japan's relationship is so deep. Is that crowding out opportunities for Korea to collaborate in development or economic cooperation?
Yeah, I think Japan will continue to become a kind of a strong barrier for any kind of partnership that South Korea would like to form with India, Australia, or with Southeast Asia country. Particularly for a regions, because the Japanese has been excellent in terms of having their infrastructure diplomacy. And if we see from Abe Shinzo's period, they had introduced the partnership for quality infrastructure. Then they revised it to expanded partnership of quality infrastructure, EPQI. So that's a robust Japanese diplomacy is there in the region, which will continue to create hurdles for South Korea and South Korean diplomacy. But I think still there is a scope for partnership. And this partnership can be formed in specific areas. Not in everything, not in all areas, but in specific areas. And I think there South Korea has to shortlist those areas, prioritize those areas in its foreign policy, and stay engaged with India, Australia, and some of the Southeast Asian countries. And also, I think the primary difference that we need to understand where South Korea is not really actualizing it in its foreign policy in comparison to Japan. And I think Japanese foreign policy believes in alignment politics, alliance building politics. South Korean politics, even though South Korea has a strong alliance with the US, it doesn't really echoes a alignment policy in the Indo-Pacific or in the Southeast Asia or in the South Asian regions. We don't have so many trilaterals partnerships that South Korea forms in the regions. In comparison to Japan. Japan has so many trilateral formulations in Southeast Asia to Indo-Pacific regions. That's not the case with South Korea. So therefore, I think South Korea needs to prioritize the sectors, the issues which can be credible for its partnership with India, Australia, and Southeast Asia. There is also a third element that we need to understand. And I think South Korea also needs to have a more concentrated dialogue with India and with some of the Southeast Asian countries in specific multilateral forums. For example, ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank. South Korea is a member there. India is a member in AIIB. India and South Korea can cooperate, supporting each other's, schemes and funding patterns, and negating some or challenging some of the Chinese unilateral initiatives. Similarly, if we talk about RCEP, India withdrew at the last moment. India withdrew from the RCEP negotiation. Had there been a better partnership or better negotiation between South Korea and India, probably it would have been much easier for India to make it to RCEP, even though India did not join RCEP for a lot of other reasons, but still there could have been a better chemistry between India and South Korea. Similarly, if we talk about B3W initiatives, build a better world initiatives, there is a scope for India and South Korea to cooperate along with Australia in the G7, recent G7 summit. There was a talk about B3W initiatives, and the Americans were talking about taking forward the B3W initiatives. India, South Korea, and Australia were invited there, as a guest member to participate in those G7 summit. And I think we could also cooperate under the B3W initiatives in terms of enhancing the infrastructure and connectivity issues, in terms of addressing the global governance issues. Talk about pandemic health corporations. So there are many areas that India and South Korea, along with Australia, they can cooperate along with Southeast Asia. But we need to prioritize those areas and sectors in order to visualize a more effective partnership.
Great, thank you. And I think Satu had kind of a follow-up on this question about Japan's standing in Southeast Asia. How do troubled ROC-Japan relations constrain the NSP there? So Chiew-Ping, if you want to give us a little bit of a look into.
Yes, thanks, Kathy, and thank you, Satu, for that question. So I think all of those initiatives offered in ASEAN countries are not necessarily competitive or exclusive to each other. So ASEAN region is a location where many of the initiatives are complementary to each other, and inclusivity is the key theme in ASEAN centrality. So in a way, Japan would not interfere or constrain South Korea's new Southern policy, and likewise, South Korea or China would not interfere in Japan's overseas development assistance in those countries as well. So Korea Mekong, Japan Mekong, US Mekong Cooperation Initiative is quite a clear example of which China also offered Lanchang Mekong Initiative cooperation in that region. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. And then, we have another question from Satu that I think is really, really good. It's directed at Dr. Choe, but I think others will also have an opinion on this. So we've talked a lot about how China motivates the new Southern policy, but they ask, how important is U.S. driving factor in the new Southern policy? We know, obviously South Korea is also very economically reliant on the U.S. and for security as well. So.
Yeah, well, in my understanding, President Moon didn't present a new Southern policy as a security policy. It is more of the economic and non-strategic functional cooperation initiative toward Southeast Asia and India. So in that regard, I think there are some very positive kind of outcomes to the extent that Korea was able to expand economic engagement with Southeast Asia and India. And also the other side of that, the downside of that sort of approach, unbalanced approach, is that you don't really go far in substantive strategy cooperation. So that's the current limitations of the Southern policy as far as I can see it. So I hope that, but I mean, last May, President Moon met with President Biden, and they came up with a very strong statement, joint statement regarding the future collaboration between Korea's New Southern Policy NSP and U.S. Indo-Pacific vision. So I would hope and expect that the next government, we in Korea will have another presidential election coming next, actually March. So we'll have a new government taking in office starting May next year. So probably I think the next president and next administration will carry on with this new southern policy, because I mean in Korean foreign policy and domestic economic policy, you have very sharp, stark contrast and partisan difference. I mean, for example, President Moon's North Korean approach is heavily criticized by the conservative, the opposition political bloc, and also the President Moon's China policy also heavily criticized, and his domestic economic policy also heavily criticized. But the ruling party, as well as the opposition party, does not have any partisan difference regarding the southern policy. So NSP is the most successful foreign policy initiative on the Moon administration, right? So in that regard, I think we might have a different brand name of the policy initiative under the next incoming administration. But I do believe that the succeeding government will carry on with New Southern policy. And because we have a pretty strong statement, agreement between Moon and President Biden, I think the next counterpart, succeeding President Moon to President Biden, will carry on with the agreement. So in that regard, I think I hope a greater level of cooperation and collaboration with the U.S. Regarding New Southern policy. So also, Sadu raised the question about CTPPP. Well, the Korean government's position regarding CTPPP has changed a little bit, especially China showed its interest in joining CTPPP. I don't really expect China be able to access CTPPP in the near future, but that provides some sort of motivation for South Korean government to have greater interest on CTPPP. I mean, in order for South Korea to get access to CPTPP, you need open all the agriculture and sensitive the commercial areas. So which is really difficult for Korean domestic economic sector. Actually, when the Park Geun-hye, the President Park administration, considered the joining CPTPP about 5 years ago, we have very strong domestic resistance regarding CPTPP, and also CPTPP is led by Japan. So the troubled relationship with Japan is also a factor for Korean government to consider joining CPTPP. But I hope that things will turn more positive down the road.
Thank you. Andrew, did you have something to add as well?
Yes, I do. And I saw Satu's comment. This is where I wish we still had in-person events, because in part it depends on how this question is spun. If you ask how whether the U.S. is a factor driving NSP, if you look at the initial stages, it was about China, but it was also about U.S.-China competition, and Korea becomes collateral damage when there's this trade war going on. And as you mentioned in your report, Katie, the U.S. also wasn't that supportive when South Korea was getting punished economically, and then of course Trump was saber rattling with North Korea, so there were concerns there. So if you look at the question from that vantage point, it played some factor, but it wasn't the driving factor. But if Satu's question is really about right now, what's happening with the NSP and whether the U.S. is a driving factor, again, I still think it's, at the end of the day, it's about South Korea maintaining some semblance of foreign policy autonomy and trying to look out for its own national interests. But if those interests are somehow aligned with the U.S., we have seen more of a concerted effort in having the new Southern policy aligned with the free and open Indo-Pacific and U.S. alliance strategy. In that case, there is some. They are trying to make some kind of connection between the alliance, the Indo-Pacific strategy, and the NSP. So I wouldn't say it's driving New Southern policy, but it is certainly a factor that's shaping the direction of the NSP. I think the last part of the question gets into something that Gil Rosman raised about conservative candidates talking about how they talk about free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and the Quad. Because if we happen to see a conservative candidate win the elections, I mean, there's going to be a much greater, I think, there's always a stronger alignment with the U.S. under conservatives, but it's really a question about China, because I think domestic public opinion on China is quite negative. I know conservative candidates have talked about, addressing that China concern. I mean, it becomes an electoral issue as well too. And I think conservatives will pick up on it, knowing that the domestic population is quite negative on China. Conservatives will be harder on China, and that will make conservative candidates more open and following the U.S. lead on Indo-Pacific strategy. And if that's the case, it's a question of how conservatives would rebrand its policy towards Southeast Asia or India. As Dr. Chen mentioned, it might go under a different name, but will we begin seeing less of a independent New Southern policy and seeing South Korea come up with its own Indo-Pacific strategy? So that would be a case where I think the U.S. may be driving then the next iteration of South Korea's policy towards Southeast Asia and South Asia. I'd love to actually hear Dr. Choe's thoughts on that question as well, or anyone else's. Thanks.
Yeah,
Well,
I think we can. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think the Moon administration's approach regarding NSP and its approach toward Quad is a little bit different. So, I mean, of course, it is related, but my impression is that Korean government tried to differentiate NSP from the Quad. So the government tends to regard Quad as an issue between U.S. and China. And NSP, they try to approach NSP as a non-political, non-kind of strategic, functional kind of cooperation kind of issue. So in that way, you try to depoliticize, you try to desensitize the strategic sensitiveness of what we face vis-a-vis U.S. and China strategic competition. So, but I think that also is the downside of the weak side of related to weak side of the NSP. I mean, as a regional strategy, I think you need to have some balances in economic dimension as well as social cultural cooperation dimension as well as the strategic dimension. So I think you need a lot of work to do in this regard. And the presidential candidates from the ruling party and the conservative opposition bloc, they have radically different approach vis-a-vis Quad and what we need to do about the U.S.-China kind of strategic competition. The conservative try to emphasize the importance of alliance, keeping alliance, getting the alliance stronger. And the ruling party, the progressive political bloc, try to emphasize the importance of autonomous and independent kind of position vis-a-vis U.S. and China. So there are some differences. So so I think we might have radically different policy approach depending on who gets the position of presidential house in the coming election.
Yeah, it'll be exciting to watch. We are basically at time, but I want to give Jagannath and Chiew-Ping an opportunity to maybe give some concluding thoughts on any of this discussion about, multilateral connections to the NSP or the upcoming election, if both of you have something to add.
Let me share two specific points. One is about India-South Korea ties in the context of New Southern policy. I think even though Moon Jae-in administration is going to finish his term and Moon Jae-in is going to retire from the politics probably, but I think what we are going to see is that there will be a continuation in South Korean's new government's approach as far as the new southern policy is concerned. And in that context, I think cooperation with India would be one of the prime significance for South Korea. Infrastructure cooperation, defense cooperations, and in defense cooperation, a lot of cooperation is already taking place. And I think South Korea would like to keep a momentum with that. For example, in port building, shipbuilding, and particularly in defense purchases, India is purchasing a lot of small military items from South Korea, and South Korea is gradually emerging as a reliable defense partner. So I think this momentum will be carried on. On cyber technology and solar renewable energy, one might see new area, partnership evolving. But my last point about the broader Indo-Pacific partnership, I think India is a little hesitant to cooperate outrightly with South Korea a lot when it comes to the regional politics is concerned. That is primarily for regions because South Korea is not really open about indulging in geopolitical games and politics that openly, like the way Japan is involved. And I think a lack of openness, lack of frankness from South Korea has not really encouraged India to look South Korea more as a effective Indo-Pacific partner. But I think if the new administration makes a change into that, India will be very open about collaborating with South Korea at the regional level, at the regional theater.
Great. And then Chiew-Ping, I guess you can close us out.
Right. So I think taking off where Jagannath has left off is about the key here is about coordination and also mutual exchange, whether at the bilateral level or multilateral, is also a great way to enhance understanding about each other's condition. So I think reservation of South Korea in India is because of the highly confrontational tone towards China in many of India's policy. So this is why it is quite comfortable for South Korea to align their policy closer to ASEAN. Their three main pillars also mirror ASEAN's three community building initiative. So in many ways, trying to not to take side and not to be confrontational and to highlight inclusivity would be the key to mutual cooperation and coordinate among regional partners to ensure that this post-pandemic world will not be more challenging to manage.
Great, thank you. And so I guess we'll end there. And thank you again so much to all of our panelists, again, especially for joining so late in the evening. I guess the benefit of these online events is that we can easily include our friends in Asia, but it does mean they have to stay up very late. So thank you. And thank you also to the audience for asking great questions. And I hope if you have a chance to read the report that you might look it up. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night to our panelists and a good rest of your day for everyone in the US.
Thank you.